The terrace was gone, and the embankment was all that remained. My orders were to hold the ground, even as the line around me disappeared. The wireless was silent. My superiors could not see that I was alone behind the wall. I kept the Bren firing in measured bursts, not to win, but to delay what was already decided. When the last round was spent, I understood how narrow a position can become before it is only one man and the dark. In the early summer of 1944, the Allied campaign in Italy had entered a difficult transitional phase. Rome had fallen to Allied forces on 4 June, but the German Army Group C had withdrawn in relatively good order to prepare defensive positions farther north. The terrain beyond the capital offered natural advantages to the defenders. Mountain ridgelines, narrow valleys, and limited road networks favored units skilled in delaying action. For the Allied command, progress required costly, methodical advances supported by artillery and armor that were often constrained by geography. By late June, along a sector near the Arno River Valley, elements of the British 8th Army were engaged in clearing operations against entrenched German formations. These operations rarely resembled sweeping maneuvers. Instead, they consisted of incremental assaults against farmhouses, stone outbuildings, and terraced slopes that had been converted into strongpoints. Small unit engagements defined the daily rhythm of the campaign. Within one such infantry battalion, part of a British line regiment with prior service in North Africa, Company Sergeant Major Thomas Hargreaves carried out duties that were both administrative and operational. As Company Sergeant Major, his responsibilities centered on discipline, supply distribution, casualty accounting, and maintaining communication between platoon commanders and the company commander. He was not an officer and did not issue tactical orders in the formal sense. His authority derived from experience and from the quiet expectation that he would keep the company functioning under strain. Hargreaves was 34 years old. Before the war, he had worked in railway maintenance in Lancashire. He had enlisted in 1939 and served through the Western Desert Campaign, where he had learned the importance of terrain, water discipline, and measured response under fire. By 1944, he was considered dependable rather than exceptional. Battalion records described him as steady, thorough, and composed in adverse conditions. Such language was typical of the period and did not imply distinction beyond reliability. On the morning of 28 June 1944, his company was assigned to support an advance along a low ridge overlooking a cluster of agricultural buildings. Aerial reconnaissance had indicated limited German presence. Intelligence assessments suggested that the enemy had withdrawn most heavy weapons northward during the previous week. The task was framed as a probing operation to secure the ridge and determine the depth of resistance. The weather was clear but humid. Artillery preparation was brief, limited by ammunition allocation and by uncertainty about exact enemy positions. At 0700 hours, 2 platoons moved forward in extended line, supported by a section of Bren gun teams positioned to provide covering fire from a shallow depression. Hargreaves moved between the rear elements and the company commander's forward position. His immediate concern was maintaining spacing and ensuring that ammunition carriers kept pace with the leading sections. Experience had taught him that small engagements often stalled, not because of enemy strength, but because of logistical missteps. Initial movement met no resistance. The ridge appeared quiet. Fields of dry grass lay between stone walls that segmented the farmland. However, as the leading platoon approached a farmhouse complex midway up the slope, a concealed German machine gun opened fire from an upper window. The first burst struck the stone wall behind which the platoon had begun to assemble. A second burst caused casualties among a Bren team attempting to reposition. The German defensive setup was typical of the campaign. Instead of continuous trench lines, small, self-contained positions covered likely avenues of approach. Each strongpoint could delay advancing troops while neighboring units prepared fallback positions. The company commander ordered the left platoon to flank the farmhouse, while the right platoon provided suppressing fire. Hargreaves relayed instructions, ensuring that stretcher-bearers moved forward under cover. Mortar support was requested from battalion headquarters, but communication lines were unreliable. Field telephones required wire that had to be physically laid across exposed ground, and wireless sets were limited in range and susceptible to interference from terrain. As the flanking maneuver began, a second German weapon revealed itself from a concealed trench near an olive grove. This crossfire pinned down the advancing section. Casualties increased incrementally rather than dramatically. One man wounded while shifting position, another struck while attempting to retrieve additional ammunition. By 0830 hours, it had become clear that the enemy presence was stronger than anticipated. What had been assessed as a light screening force was instead a reinforced platoon occupying interlocking positions. The artillery preparation earlier that morning had not neutralized these points, likely because the defenders had remained under cover until the barrage lifted. Hargreaves observed the developing situation from behind a stone wall roughly 30 yards behind the forwardmost section. He noted the growing strain on ammunition supply. Bren gunners were firing controlled bursts, but the exchange was prolonged. Runners dispatched to battalion for heavier support faced exposed routes. The company commander attempted to coordinate a renewed push once mortar fire arrived. However, the mortars fell slightly long on their first adjustment, forcing a correction that consumed valuable time. During this interval, German rifle fire intensified from the farmhouse courtyard, suggesting that the defenders were being reinforced from positions beyond immediate view. At approximately 0915 hours, a shell, likely from a concealed 75mm infantry gun positioned behind the ridge, struck near the right platoon's assembly point. The explosion disrupted communications and wounded the platoon commander. Leadership of that element devolved to a junior sergeant who had limited experience in independent command. The operational problem was becoming evident. The company had committed 2 platoons into an engagement without full knowledge of enemy depth. Terrain restricted visibility, and the ridgeline prevented easy withdrawal without exposing troops to direct fire. Supporting armor had not yet been brought forward because the narrow farm tracks required engineering clearance. Hargreaves' role remained formally unchanged. He moved among the men, redistributing ammunition from wounded soldiers to those still engaged. He ensured that casualty reports were compiled and sent rearward. When a section leader hesitated to shift position after losing 2 men, Hargreaves provided brief instruction, emphasizing fields of fire rather than urging speed. There were no dramatic gestures recorded in the battalion log. Instead, the entries note that company elements encountered determined resistance, progress limited. Such language understated the mounting difficulty. By mid-morning, the left platoon's flanking attempt had stalled in the olive grove, pinned by accurate rifle fire from a low stone terrace. Efforts to identify the enemy's command position proved inconclusive. Smoke grenades were used to obscure movement, but shifting winds dispersed the cover unevenly. The farmhouse itself remained a focal point. Its thick walls absorbed small arms fire effectively, and upper-story windows provided advantageous firing angles. Shortly before 1000 hours, the company commander conferred briefly with Hargreaves regarding casualty distribution and ammunition reserves. The decision was made to hold current positions until heavier artillery could be coordinated from brigade level. Withdrawal was considered, but judged hazardous given exposed slopes. Early signs of strain were apparent. Water supplies ran low under the increasing heat. Wireless batteries required replacement. Runners returned with fragmented reports indicating additional German movement on the far side of the ridge, though precise numbers were unclear. From his position, Hargreaves could see that the forwardmost section had been reduced to half strength. The Bren gun that had anchored their position was silent. Its gunner had been evacuated with a leg wound. A replacement was attempting to clear a jam under intermittent fire. The situation had not yet reached collapse, but the margin for error had narrowed. The company's advance had halted well short of its objective. Supporting elements were delayed, and enemy resistance appeared coordinated rather than improvised. By late morning, the ridge remained contested ground. The battalion as a whole had committed adjacent companies to similar probing actions along parallel sectors, stretching artillery support thin. Reports indicated that German forces were executing a controlled delay rather than retreating outright. Hargreaves continued his routine tasks, checking casualty lists, directing stretcher bearers, advising section leaders on ammunition rationing. There was no indication at this stage that the engagement would diverge significantly from other costly advances that characterized the Italian campaign. Yet the operational picture suggested limitations that would soon test the company's cohesion. Communications were fragile, reinforcement uncertain. The defenders were entrenched in depth. As midday approached, the sound of distant artillery increased, suggesting broader engagement along the front. Within Hargreaves' immediate sector, however, movement had slowed to measured exchanges of fire across stone walls and fields scorched by summer heat. The ridge had not been secured. The farmhouse remained in German hands. Casualties were mounting steadily, and the company's ability to maneuver was diminishing with each hour. The engagement paused in a state of tension rather than resolution, with both sides holding ground under the expectation of renewed action. The engagement resumed shortly after midday, as higher command attempted to restore momentum along the sector. Brigade artillery was reassigned temporarily to support the battalion's position near the ridge. At 12:15 hours, a coordinated barrage began, targeting the farmhouse complex and the terraces identified earlier as German firing points. The bombardment was methodical rather than overwhelming. Ammunition stocks in Italy remained finite, and allocation reflected broader operational priorities across the front. From behind cover, Company Sergeant Major Thomas Hargreaves observed the pattern of impacts through field glasses borrowed from a platoon commander. Several shells struck the outer walls of the farmhouse, dislodging roof tiles and sending fragments into the courtyard. Smoke rose briefly, but the structure itself remained largely intact. The terraces received more direct hits, though it was difficult to assess whether the defenders had been neutralized or merely withdrawn into deeper shelter. When the barrage lifted at 12:35 hours, the company commander ordered a renewed advance. The left platoon was instructed to press through the olive grove and secure the terrace line, while the remnants of the right platoon were to provide suppressive fire. A small reserve section, previously held back, was committed to reinforce the center. The men advanced cautiously, aware that German units frequently waited out artillery fire in cellars or dugouts. Their caution proved warranted. Within minutes, a machine gun resumed firing from a position slightly offset from the farmhouse, likely relocated during the barrage. The shift in firing angle caught the advancing section in partial enfilade, forcing them to ground. Losses accumulated incrementally. A corporal attempting to reposition a Bren gun was struck in the shoulder. A private carrying mortar rounds fell while crossing a low wall. There were no large explosions, no sweeping charges, only the steady attrition of men moving under observation. Hargreaves moved forward again, this time nearer to the terrace line. He coordinated with the junior sergeant now commanding the right platoon, advising that fire discipline be maintained and that bursts remain short to conserve ammunition. Resupply remained irregular. Runners sent rearward returned with limited quantities, as transport along the narrow approach road was delayed by shell damage and congestion from other units. By early afternoon, it became evident that the German position extended beyond the visible structures. Rifle fire was reported from scrubland north of the farmhouse, suggesting a secondary defensive line. The battalion's initial intelligence assessment had underestimated both depth and preparation. Official doctrine emphasized maintaining forward pressure to prevent the enemy from stabilizing their defense. However, the company's capacity to execute maneuver was steadily diminishing. Platoon strength had eroded. Leaders were either wounded or burdened with dual responsibilities. Communication between flanks was inconsistent, relying on shouted signals or runners crossing exposed ground. At approximately 13:45 hours, another artillery round, this time believed to originate from a concealed German gun, landed near the olive grove. The blast wounded 2 men and destroyed the company's remaining functional wireless set. The loss of radio contact with battalion headquarters forced reliance on physical message carriers, further slowing coordination. The company commander conferred briefly with Hargreaves behind partial cover near a collapsed stone wall. Reports from adjacent companies indicated similar resistance along parallel ridges. Brigade support was now divided, reducing the likelihood of sustained artillery assistance. The commander expressed concern that continued frontal pressure would produce further casualties without decisive gain. Yet withdrawal presented equal risk. The slope offered limited cover for retreating troops, and German observers maintained clear sightlines from higher ground. Hargreaves listened without offering strategic judgment. His role remained execution rather than policy. He noted casualty figures quietly and ensured that stretcher bearers rotated in pairs to avoid exhaustion. Water distribution had become problematic. Several canteens were empty, and the afternoon heat intensified fatigue. By 14:30 hours, the left platoon had secured a portion of the terrace, but was unable to advance beyond it. The farmhouse remained active, with intermittent fire from its upper windows. Attempts to approach within grenade range were repelled by accurate rifle shots from concealed slit positions. Repeated efforts to silence the machine gun position met limited success. A Bren team temporarily suppressed it, but ammunition expenditure was high. Replacement magazines arrived sporadically, sometimes carried by soldiers already strained from earlier movement. The battalion log later described this phase as continued engagement with resolute enemy resistance, progress negligible. The phrasing reflected the restrained language of official records, yet on the ground, the erosion of combat effectiveness was increasingly apparent. Shortly after 1500 hours, the company commander was struck by a fragment from a mortar round that detonated against the terrace wall. Though not immediately fatal, the wound incapacitated him. Command of the company passed to the senior surviving platoon officer, a lieutenant with limited field command experience. The transition introduced hesitation. Orders were slower, more cautious. Doctrine prescribed maintaining offensive posture, but practical limitations imposed restraint. The lieutenant sought clarification from battalion headquarters, dispatching a runner with a request for either reinforced support or authorization to consolidate defensive positions. The runner did not return within the expected time frame. German fire intensified intermittently rather than continuously, suggesting deliberate ammunition conservation. From their vantage points, the defenders appeared content to maintain pressure without overextending. It was consistent with the broader German strategy in Italy: delay, inflict casualties, withdraw only when necessary. As afternoon progressed, the company's strength had fallen significantly below morning levels. Sections that began the day with 10 or 12 men now counted 6 or fewer fit for action. Bren guns remained operational, but with reduced crews. Mortar rounds were nearly exhausted. Hargreaves continued to circulate, his movements deliberate and measured. He corrected a misaligned firing position, redistributed remaining ammunition from wounded men, and ensured that casualty markers were visible for later retrieval. There was no outward display of urgency, only sustained attention to detail. Around 1600 hours, sporadic firing from the olive grove indicated further German probing. It became evident that the enemy might attempt a limited counter-movement to reclaim the terrace section secured earlier. The company lacked depth to repel a coordinated push. The lieutenant ordered consolidation behind the stone terrace, effectively shifting from assault to holding posture. This adjustment was pragmatic, but signaled recognition that the initial objective, the full capture of the ridge and farmhouse, would not be achieved that day. A second runner was dispatched to battalion. He returned near 1700 hours with fragmented instructions. Hold present ground if feasible. Reinforcements uncertain. Artillery support limited due to commitments elsewhere. The daylight was beginning to soften, but the tactical position remained unresolved. The farmhouse still functioned as an enemy strongpoint. Casualties were being assembled in a shallow depression for evacuation after dark. Ammunition stocks were critically low in several sections. The growing divergence between operational doctrine and battlefield reality was visible. Doctrine encouraged sustained advance under artillery cover. Reality offered fragmented support and diminishing manpower. The company was expected to maintain pressure while increasingly unable to project it. As the afternoon wore on, firing decreased slightly, replaced by cautious observation on both sides. Neither force committed to full assault. The ridge had become a narrow band of contested ground where movement invited immediate response. By early evening, Hargreaves stood near the terrace wall, surveying the reduced line of men under his supervision. The company had not broken, but its cohesion was strained. Leadership was thin. Communications were improvised. The original objective remained unfulfilled. The operational problem had evolved from seizing a position to preserving what remained of the company's fighting capacity. The light continued to fade, and with it, the expectation of decisive movement before nightfall. By 1830 hours, daylight had thinned across the ridge, softening the sharp outlines of the farmhouse and the terraces. The exchange of fire diminished to sporadic shots, each side conserving ammunition and strength. The company's effective fighting force had been reduced to fewer than 30 men, distributed unevenly across the stone walls and shallow depressions that served as improvised cover. The acting company commander, the young lieutenant who had assumed control after the earlier casualty, received a final message from battalion headquarters just before wireless contact failed entirely. The instruction was concise. Maintain present positions through the night if practicable. Further support would be evaluated at first light. No reinforcement timetable was specified. The message reflected the wider situation along the front. Adjacent companies were similarly engaged, and brigade reserves were limited. The battalion could not easily extract one company without exposing another sector. The ridge was to be held, not necessarily advanced. As darkness approached, German activity resumed in measured intervals. Illumination flares were launched intermittently from behind the farmhouse, casting brief white arcs across the slope. Each flare froze movement, revealing silhouettes against stone and scrub. When darkness returned, rifle fire followed, probing for exposed figures. Shortly after 1900 hours, a concentrated burst from the machine gun position struck near the center of the company's line. 2 men were killed instantly. A third was wounded while attempting to pull one of them to cover. The lieutenant, moving forward to assess the disruption, was hit by a rifle round that grazed his neck and left him disoriented. Command cohesion faltered. The senior non-commissioned officer among the forward sections was already down. Communication between the left and right elements was reduced to shouted exchanges that risked drawing fire. In the fading light, the company's alignment became uneven, with gaps forming between positions. Hargreaves moved forward under low cover to locate the lieutenant. He found him conscious but bleeding and unable to stand steadily. A stretcher was requested, but none could reach the position immediately without crossing exposed ground. The lieutenant issued a brief instruction to hold the terrace and prevent enemy penetration. Beyond that, he deferred practical control to the senior non-commissioned presence. In the absence of clear direction from above, Hargreaves assumed coordination of the immediate defensive line. His actions were not accompanied by formal declaration. He shifted men from relatively sheltered rear positions to fill gaps along the terrace wall. He ordered fire to be directed toward the machine gun's last visible muzzle flash rather than toward indistinct movement in the grove. German pressure increased gradually rather than explosively. Small groups advanced cautiously from the farmhouse perimeter, testing the British line. Grenades were thrown toward the terrace. One detonated near a Bren position, killing the gunner and wounding his assistant. The weapon remained intact, but unmanned. Hargreaves reached the Bren gun and repositioned it slightly behind a fractured section of wall. He instructed a nearby private, barely 19 years old, to feed ammunition while he adjusted the bipod. His previous desert experience with automatic weapons allowed him to correct the angle without extended exposure. Short, controlled bursts were fired toward the olive grove, forcing the advancing German element to withdraw temporarily. By 2000 hours, the company's line had contracted further. Casualties lay in shallow recesses behind stone. Ammunition had dwindled to partial magazines distributed unevenly among the remaining men. Water was nearly exhausted. The wounded lieutenant had been carried to a sheltered depression, leaving the forward line without commissioned leadership. The operational situation had shifted from contested assault to isolated defense. Battalion headquarters remained unaware of the company's precise strength due to the breakdown in communication. Adjacent companies were engaged on their own fronts and unable to provide lateral support. German movement resumed under cover of partial darkness. Voices were heard near the farmhouse courtyard, followed by coordinated rifle fire from two directions. It became apparent that the defenders intended to push British forces off the terrace before night fully settled. Hargreaves recognized that a static defense along the existing wall would invite encirclement. The terrace offered limited depth, and the farmhouse's elevated windows provided overlapping fields of fire. If the line collapsed at any single point, withdrawal down the slope would expose the men to direct fire without organized covering support. At approximately 20-30 hours, he made a measured adjustment. Without waiting for explicit instruction, he directed the remaining fit men to fall back 10 yards to a lower stone embankment that provided slightly better defilade from the farmhouse windows. The movement was executed in pairs, each covering the other with single, deliberate shots. The shift was modest but significant. It shortened the line and consolidated the remaining strength. The terrace itself was partially relinquished, but the lower position reduced exposure to enfilade fire from the olive grove. German forces advanced cautiously to the abandoned upper wall. A brief exchange followed as they attempted to exploit the movement. Hargreaves maintained disciplined bursts from the Bren gun, preventing immediate occupation of the terrace in strength. Darkness now obscured precise targeting, increasing reliance on sound and intermittent muzzle flashes. By 2100 hours, the engagement had narrowed to close-range exchanges within fragmented stone boundaries. Several British soldiers were killed during this phase. One by one, the sections diminished. Ammunition was shared across positions, sometimes reduced to 2 or 3 magazines per man. Hargreaves moved between points, checking that no gap widened unnoticed. His presence was practical rather than symbolic. He redistributed grenades from fallen soldiers and ensured that no weapon lay unused. When a private expressed uncertainty about his firing arc, Hargreaves adjusted his position and indicated the approximate line of approach using a brief, quiet instruction. The night air carried dust and smoke from earlier shelling. Visibility was inconsistent. German voices grew closer, suggesting that small assault groups were attempting infiltration through the scrub. Shortly after 21:30 hours, a coordinated push struck the center of the lower embankment. Grenades landed in quick succession. The blast disoriented several defenders and killed 2 outright. In the confusion, German soldiers reached the upper terrace and began firing downward. Hargreaves ordered the remaining men to hold the embankment at all costs. The phrase was not dramatic. It reflected immediate necessity. Retreat further down the slope would result in exposure on open ground without organized covering fire. The Bren gun jammed during sustained use. Hargreaves cleared it under limited light, fingers moving deliberately despite the dust accumulation. When firing resumed, it was slower but controlled. Within minutes, another explosion struck near his position. He was knocked sideways but remained conscious. Assessing quickly, he realized that only a small cluster of defenders remained immediately around him. The German assault faltered briefly under return fire. Yet the British line was now severely reduced. Shouts for ammunition were answered with silence. One by one, the remaining men near Hargreaves were hit or forced to withdraw a few yards rearward. By approximately 2200 hours, the engagement had narrowed to isolated pockets of resistance along the lower wall. Hargreaves maintained position with the Bren gun and 2 nearby soldiers whose ammunition was nearly expended. The ridge was largely in German hands once more, save for the thin strip of ground anchored at the embankment. The fighting continued in short, abrupt bursts under near-total darkness. By 22:30 hours, the ridge had become a fragmented line of isolated resistance. The German assault had regained the upper terrace and much of the olive grove. The lower embankment, where Company Sergeant Major Thomas Hargreaves remained positioned, formed the final organized point of British defense in that sector. The 2 soldiers beside him were both wounded, one with a bandaged forearm darkened by blood, the other moving stiffly from shrapnel in his thigh. Ammunition had been reduced to a handful of magazines and several grenades gathered from fallen men. The Bren gun remained functional, but unreliable after repeated exposure to dust and debris. German movement could be heard above the embankment. Boots shifted against stone. Occasional murmured commands carried through the night air. The defenders were close enough now that individual rifle bolts could be distinguished between bursts. Hargreaves understood the tactical position with clarity. The company's cohesion had dissolved under cumulative losses. Communication with battalion headquarters was non-existent. Adjacent units, themselves engaged, were unlikely to be aware that this forward element had contracted to such a degree. Doctrine would have favored a fighting withdrawal once strength dropped below effective holding capacity. However, the slope behind the embankment offered little protection. A retreat in darkness across open ground risked disorganized flight and further casualties. Moreover, abandoning the position entirely would open a gap between neighboring companies, potentially exposing them to flanking fire at first light. He chose to maintain the embankment as long as ammunition permitted. At approximately 22:45 hours, a probing German group descended cautiously toward the lower wall. A flare illuminated the slope in harsh white light. For a brief moment, silhouettes were sharply defined. German figures moving in staggered formation, weapons held low. Hargreaves fired a controlled burst from the Bren gun, sweeping slightly left to right. One figure fell. The others dropped behind stone. The 2 remaining British soldiers added single rifle shots, then ceased as their magazines emptied. The flare faded. Darkness returned. Grenades followed from above, thrown without full visibility but guided by the earlier flare's exposure. One detonated several yards short. Another landed close to the embankment's edge, showering debris over the defenders. The soldier with the injured forearm was struck again and fell silent. The remaining rifleman attempted to reload but discovered his ammunition pouch empty. he informed Hargreaves quietly. There was no panic in his tone, only acknowledgement. Hargreaves passed him a final grenade and instructed him to withdraw 5 yards to a shallow depression behind the embankment. The instruction was brief and practical. The soldier hesitated, then complied. Alone at the wall, Hargreaves adjusted the Bren gun's position slightly lower, using a fractured section of stone for partial concealment. He fired intermittently, conserving the remaining rounds. Each burst was deliberate, aimed toward sound rather than sight. German forces approached more cautiously now. The resistance from below had been stronger than anticipated for a position believed nearly exhausted. Voices above the embankment debated in low tones before another flare was launched. The second flare illuminated a reduced scene: scattered equipment, fallen bodies along the terrace, and a single functioning automatic weapon firing from the lower wall. Rifle fire converged on the embankment. Stone fragments chipped away. A round struck the Bren gun's barrel casing, deflecting without disabling it. Hargreaves shifted position again, lowering his profile further behind the wall. The rifleman in the depression behind him threw his final grenade when movement appeared at the edge of the embankment. The explosion momentarily halted the descent. Minutes stretched without clear resolution. The Germans did not rush blindly forward. Their approach remained measured, consistent with prior discipline throughout the day. They had achieved the primary objective of reclaiming the terrace. Further advance would be incremental. Hargreaves' ammunition dwindled to a final magazine. He reduced firing to single bursts separated by silence. The effect was less suppressive, but maintained the impression of continued defense. Around 23:15 hours, a lull settled over the ridge. Sporadic shots echoed from distant sectors, but immediate movement near the embankment paused. It was possible that the German platoon commander was reassessing the cost of further advance in darkness against an unseen but persistent defender. The rifleman behind Hargreaves attempted to crawl closer, but was struck by a shot from above before reaching the wall. He fell without sound. The embankment was now held by one man. Hargreaves continued to fire sparingly, altering his angle slightly between bursts to suggest multiple positions. The tactic required no elaborate calculation, only awareness of terrain and sound reflection among the stone walls. German voices resumed, closer than before. A final grenade landed short of the wall and detonated against the slope, sending earth downward. The Bren gun jammed again under accumulated dust and heat. Working by touch, Hargreaves cleared the obstruction. His movements were steady, conditioned by prior experience rather than urgency. When the weapon resumed function, he fired the last controlled burst of the engagement. The magazine emptied. He checked instinctively for additional rounds and found none. The ridge was quiet for several seconds. Then cautious steps approached from above and to the left. Without ammunition, the Bren gun could no longer serve its purpose. His sidearm, carried but rarely used, remained holstered with limited rounds. At this stage, the tactical purpose had shifted. The embankment had been held long enough to delay full German consolidation before midnight. The adjacent companies, if still in position, would not face immediate flank penetration during darkness. German figures descended the slope with weapons trained on the lower wall. One called out in accented English for surrender. The command was clear, repeated twice. Hargreaves assessed his condition. He had sustained minor injuries from debris, but remained capable of movement. The tactical objective, delay, had been achieved to the extent possible without reinforcement. He set the Bren gun down deliberately and raised his hands above the wall. The German soldiers approached cautiously, disarming him and searching for additional weapons. They appeared surprised to find only a single defender at the embankment. By first light on 29 June 1944, the ridge north of the Arno Valley lay quiet under a pale sky. German units consolidated their reclaimed positions along the terrace and farmhouse complex, reinforcing them with additional machine guns brought forward during the night. British artillery resumed intermittently at dawn, but its fire fell farther along the sector, directed at other contested points where resistance remained active. Company Sergeant Major Thomas Hargreaves was held with a small group of captured British soldiers in the courtyard of the farmhouse that had anchored the previous day's defense. Most were wounded to varying degrees. German medical personnel provided basic treatment consistent with established conventions, bandaging injuries before organizing transport to a rear holding area. The fighting in that immediate sector did not resume in force. The German objective had been limited to restoring their defensive line before conducting a controlled withdrawal farther north later in the week. Throughout the morning, German engineers inspected the embankment and terrace positions. They noted the concentration of spent cartridges around the lower wall where Hargreaves had made his final stand. The pattern of fire suggested prolonged resistance from a single automatic weapon. Such observations were recorded not as commendation, but as routine assessment of engagement intensity. Later that afternoon, British forces, having regrouped and received reinforcement, launched renewed pressure along adjacent ridgelines. The German company occupying the farmhouse position withdrew in stages, evacuating prisoners toward the north before relinquishing the ground under artillery threat. Hargreaves and the other captured men were transported by truck to a temporary transit camp beyond the immediate battle area. For the British battalion, the action of 28 June was summarized in operational reports as a costly engagement during probing operations. Casualty lists were compiled from partial accounts, reconstructed over several days as survivors returned or were confirmed missing. Initial estimates suggested heavy losses within the company assigned to the ridge. Confusion persisted regarding how long the forward embankment had been held after command disruption. When stragglers from the lower slope were located during subsequent advances, they reported that resistance had continued well into the night from a single position near the terrace wall. Their accounts converged on the figure of the company sergeant major maintaining the Bren gun after other positions had fallen silent. The battalion's commanding officer reviewed these statements during routine debriefings. The emphasis remained measured. The action had not altered the broader operational timetable, nor had it secured the ridge permanently. Yet within the narrow frame of the engagement, the sustained defense at the embankment had delayed German consolidation long enough to prevent immediate exploitation of a gap between adjacent British companies. Hargreaves remained in German custody for the remainder of the Italian campaign. Records indicate that he was transferred through a series of prisoner-of-war camps in northern Italy and later into Austria following the German retreat. His conduct in captivity was described in post-war interviews as consistent with his prior demeanor, reserved, methodical, and focused on maintaining morale among fellow prisoners through routine organization of shared duties. In April 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Austria, he was liberated by elements of the United States Army. After medical evaluation and administrative processing, he was repatriated to Britain in the summer of that year. Only upon return did he receive fuller understanding of the battalion's assessment of the ridge engagement. Official correspondence noted that his decision to consolidate the embankment and maintain fire under isolation had contributed materially to the orderly reorganization of neighboring units. The language remained restrained, reflecting military custom. He was awarded a Distinguished Conduct Medal in late 1945. The citation described steadfast leadership under sustained enemy pressure and acknowledged his maintenance of defensive position despite severe casualties and loss of communication. The citation did not dramatize events. It did not claim decisive alteration of the campaign. It recognized endurance and disciplined action within a confined tactical circumstance. After demobilization, Hargreaves returned to railway maintenance in Lancashire. He rarely spoke publicly about the ridge. In interviews conducted decades later by regimental historians, he referred to the action as a difficult day, and emphasized the efforts of the men who had served alongside him rather than his own conduct. The ridge itself became one of many contested elevations in the long Italian campaign, its name recorded in battalion diaries, but largely absent from broader war histories. The farmhouse was rebuilt after the war. The terraces were restored to agricultural use. Within regimental archives, however, the engagement remained documented in careful detail. Maps annotated with casualty figures and ammunition expenditure preserved the outline of that day's operations. Among those annotations was a brief notation marking the lower embankment where resistance continued after other sections had fallen silent. The ridge was one of many. The stand at the embankment was one of many acts of resistance recorded across the war. Yet within its limited frame, it illustrated the extent to which a single non-commissioned officer could maintain cohesion under circumstances where structure had collapsed. The official record closed the entry with routine phrasing: position contested, casualties sustained, ground temporarily relinquished, subsequent advance resumed. The man at the embankment returned home.